thank everyone for coming out to May's Monthly Data Nerds. I would like to thank our sponsors, Alicia, and actually I'd love her to come up and talk a little bit. She's with Tech Systems, and they provided this month's coffee, bagels, and fruit. That's an upgrade.
Hey, last month was me.
You brought coffee and bagels, which that was fantastic. I love it.
Yeah, I almost didn't pick up the fruit, and then I thought, well, why not? Go big or go home, right?
No, just messing. So thank you very much. And then next we'll have Vienna Tompkins with the Criminal Justice Institute talking about expanding abstraction and data science. So I'll just...
Yeah. I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Alicia Morgan. I work with Tech Systems, specifically here in Nashville.
Step aside a little so you can get in the web stream.
Oh, sorry.
You're good. Yeah, perfect.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I work with Tech Systems here in Nashville. For those of you that don't know Tech Systems, we're actually the nation's leading IT staffing and services firm. And I specifically support our Nashville market, specific to data analytics, so very, very focused area, which is why I wanted to come out and just meet you guys here today. I don't want to deep dive too much into our open positions or anything, but if you are interested, I'm happy to talk. We're Amazon's #1 vendor across the country. We work with them in 5 different markets right now. So as they're coming in, we're definitely having those conversations. We're working with Ernst & Young, Alliance Bernstein, pretty much all of the companies that are moving in, again, because we've been working with them in other markets. So we're very in tune to what they're doing and what their goals are. So if you are interested, then grab me afterwards, or I can leave my business cards here, whatever's best. But thanks for having me. I used to work at Ernst & Young. Really?
Yeah. Oh no. Whoa. There we go. All right. Hi, I'm Vienna Tompkins. So yeah, we're going to be talking about, this is a lot of like big words, but basically trying to put some frameworks and some structure around the concepts that we hear all the time about fairness and bias and what are those things and how can we implement them. So that's kind of what that means. So a little bit of background on me. I'm a policy and data specialist at the Crime and Justice Institute, which is based in Boston. We operate much like a consulting firm. So we take contracts from local state governments, counties, and often we work on federal grants as well. And basically what we want to do is we promote evidence-based public policy. So we come in and we look at the data and we help people make decisions using that data and sort of move away from the gut decision model that we've kind of relied on in the past. And we also really want to bridge the gap between academia and practitioners because a lot of times you have these studies that are saying these really great things, but the people who are doing the work on the ground have no way to, either it's impractical for them or they don't understand how to apply that to their local systems. And so the work that I do that's most relevant to this topic is risk assessment validation. So we often come into pretrial services agencies or to administrative office of the courts, and they say either we have this risk assessment, we want to see if it's working, or we want to implement a risk assessment and we want to make sure it works on our population. And so that's probably the most analysis heavy piece of the work that I do, and also very relevant to fairness and bias and what those things mean and how we can make statements about algorithms and how they're effective and how to use them. And then we also do just general criminal justice system assessment, policy development implementation, like I said, and then data collection, management, and analysis, all within the criminal justice system. But that also involves lots of different agencies. So courts, police departments, probation and parole, basically anyone who touches the criminal justice system has a piece of data that we're interested in. And then my research interests, aside from that, obviously algorithmic bias, ethics and data science, societal impacts of technology. So we'll get into all of those things a little bit today. So fairness and bias. I want to start by asking you all to write down, you have sticky notes and pens in front of you. On the pink sticky note, write down what you would define fairness as. And on a green sticky note, write down what you would define bias as. I know that's like a hard question, but.
Pink, green is fairness.
Pink is fairness, green is bias. Did I? If you can distill it into one thing, what would you say?
Pink is what? Fairness?
Yes, and green is bias. Yeah, I'm gonna put them on the wall. So
Green. green, but gosh,
Bias. Yeah. We'll do purple.
Gosh, this
Can you
is-
see
of
it?
course, you
Here.
can barely see it.
Oh, no, that one's dead too.
Oh, there we go.
Is that better?
Green bias.
And I will come grab those if anyone's. You done with your silver good?
No, this one should be.
Okay, thanks.
Bias. Oh gosh.
Definitely two terms that we know, just don't know how to define.
Yeah, and there is absolutely this
Therein
interesting
lies
overlap.
the challenge. So we're just writing the definition of fairness on a green sticky note and bias on a green sticky note. What you think they are? I know it's a hard question, but that's the point. Here you go. Cool. Alright.
I'm going to.
Cool. I'm gonna read them.
Okay, we'll just show the live stream. I don't normally do this, but Vienna has had us
Activities. There,
doing
thanks.
activities.
Okay. Ooh. All right, I think two more. One more. No, you're still working.
Yeah.
You can just whatever pops into your head. Doesn't have to be. There are no.
It's gotta be really good.
Not
It has to
necessarily
be
any right answers.
getting graded.
I like to say there are no wrong answers, but I've been told that that's not correct. So.
That's a bias.
I'm like, there are answers. They're all different, and that's okay. So I thought that I might have more categories that I could like move these into, but it looks like you guys are all kind of on similar pages, which is interesting. So I think we only have so far one technical definition, and the rest are a little more abstract, which is great. So we're just going to wait a couple more minutes for these two. But basically, like, obviously, it's hard to define these things, especially without any context given. Just saying, okay, what is fairness? What does that mean? How do you know? And so that's sort of what we're going to talk about a little more, and like why this is such a challenging exercise, especially to put a really, technical definition on it. You guys almost ready?
Fairness is a little easier for me because I cheated because I was, it's a topic that I've researched a little bit.
Right.
Google's done some work on it. Amazon's done
Yep.
some work on it. This concept of fairness in AI and how you can, sacrifice some accuracy, but your
Right.
model becomes more fair by a sense to that.
Yeah.
So that was easy for me. Bias, I was like, how do I define bias?
Yeah.
I don't
And
know.
see, bias is the one I deal with a lot.
Okay. I know about algorithmic bias. But I was trying to be a little more abstract than that.
Okay. So, do you want us to?
Probably just.
Okay. All right. So for fairness, we have impartiality, equality to all parties, ignoring bias. I like the use of the other word in the definition. Going by rules and I'm not sure what that last word is. Evidences, yes. Treating all entities the same, similar, same treatment for everyone, equal opportunity to succeed and fail, and then same amount of error rates across different demographics. So that's a good technical one, and that is one of the like statistical definitions of fairness. So these are all pretty similar. So let's think about equality. What does equality mean practically? What does that look like? So in the example of risk assessments, which is the example I tend to use because it's what I'm most familiar with, what does equality mean? So if you're saying we're assessing risk, does that mean everyone has the same average risk based, like regardless of race or gender? Does it mean that it depends on the percentage of those people in the population? What does that exactly mean? So even going into the definition, some of those words are hard to define. But as a principle, as a sort of a guiding principle, these are definitely useful definitions. And then looking at bias, so we have favoring a particular side, point of view, or perspective, or agenda. That's one that's definitely widely used outside of data science too. Allowing preconceived characteristics to influence significant factors. Yep. To have a certain perspective based on experiences or environment, preconceived ideas, preferential treatment. Same preconceived decision or inclination, differential treatment, preference towards fewer options than other. Yep. So those are all great definitions of bias, but also then how are those applied practically? So we all have an understanding of what these things mean. But when someone says, okay, ethics and data science, we have to be fair, we can't be biased. No one, popularly, you read articles about this stuff, no one says, okay, but here's how to do that. How do we do that? And how do we turn these into things that we can mostly all agree on instead of just sort of hand-waving and going, well, it looks good, so everything's fine. And so sociotechnical theory, which we'll get into a little bit, helps sort of provide a framework where you can make some of these decisions. So we know that they're difficult to define. I hope we understand why data scientists should care. There's obviously external pressure, and also just, most of us have, sort of a moral compass that says we should do things that are good and not bad, and we want to do what we can to do that. And then how can we integrate these concepts into our work? So that's hopefully what we're going to. We probably won't come to an answer, but we'll help sort of figure out different ways to think about these concepts and to then implement those decisions into our work. So sociotechnical systems, sociotechnical, what does this mean? It's pretty self-explanatory. Society, technology, how do they interact? How do they influence each other? And how do they, sort of balance each other out? What is sort of the flow between them? And so it seeks to describe the relationships between society and technology. It's a school of sociology, but it's also very relevant to a lot of the things that data scientists are grappling with. And so I think bringing this sort of interdisciplinary perspective can be really helpful when thinking about these things. And a lot of the frameworks of sociology can be transferred into the way we look at technology. So there are two sort of main schools of thought or ways to integrate the two. First is constructivism. It's based in social science. Artifacts are the products of social behaviors of individuals or groups. So just sort of the things that happen based on the way that humans interact. So artifacts and practices are constructions of individuals or groups. So they come out of social interaction. Closure is achieved when debate is effectively terminated. So if there are different social groups and they're trying to solve a problem or they're trying to define a problem, it's considered closure when everyone sort of comes to a consensus and says, okay, we agree this is the problem, or we agree this is the solution to the problem. And so the social construction of technology is the process that constructivism uses. And I'll get more into what that means later. But just so we're kind of on the same page about what these words mean, we'll use them in later slides. And then the systems approach, artifact builders, so people like data scientists, are concerned with the interrelated and malleable nature of artifacts. So we understand that these things are not distinct entities, that they interact with each other and they impact each other. And heterogeneous engineering is the means of assembling these artifacts. So we'll get into the next slide. So essentially, these are they're not necessarily completely separate, but they're sort of distinct ways of thinking about how technology and society interact. So for the social construction of technology, the social is sort of considered external and explanatory. It's sort of okay, we're gonna do this thing, we're gonna build this tool, and then we'll see how the social impacts it afterwards. Or if it goes wrong, we'll look back and we'll say, okay, well, how did society play a role in that going wrong? So it's a sort of a cyclical process. It starts with interpretive flexibility experienced by relevant social groups. So in the case of a risk assessment, typically what we see is the relevant social groups it includes a broader set, but typically the only people involved in the development are people in the criminal justice system and whoever they hire to build the risk assessment. However, the people who will be assessed by the tool and the community are also relevant social groups. So these groups acknowledge that there's a problem, and the period of interpretive flexibility is them trying to figure out what that problem is, to figure out, okay, we know something's going on and we want to know what the problem is, and then to come up with a solution. And so stabilization is the process of outlining what those things are practically and saying, here are the things that we need to do. And so the one relevant social group that we would be a part of would be the data scientists, the technologists, what have you. Or the designers, we come up with different solutions. We come up with different ways to solve the problem. And we say, to the relevant social groups, okay, does this solve the problem? Do you think this solves your problem? And then as they decide, okay, yes, this does, no, this doesn't, and come up with a better idea of what the problem is, then eventually we reach closure where everyone agrees this is the tool that solves the problem, and then they can implement it and move forward. But of course, as is true with most things, society changes, the needs of the community change, and this is why we do things like validation to make sure the tools are still working. And then we kind of go back to a period of interpretive flexibility where we're saying, okay, is this problem still solved? If it's not, then we need to kind of do this process again. So it's a cyclical process, and often the social is sort of on the outside. We're focusing more on the technology. But when we're talking about heterogeneous engineering, it's more of you think of things as a network of different artifacts or different elements that they're not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous, so there's a tension between them. They might not necessarily naturally fit together or work together, but we need to bring them together so that they can all exist in a network. And also it often deals with emergent properties in terms of the technology, where the end result is different than the sum of all of its different pieces. It has different qualities than the different pieces involved. And so in heterogeneous engineering, the social aspect, the societal aspect, is one of those elements in the network. So it's considered from the get-go as a piece that needs to be part of the development process. And the piece about hostile or different environment is just acknowledging that we don't control everything, we can't control everything, and we can't anticipate everything that might happen once we sort of release our tools or our models into the wild. So those are the two sort of main schools of thought in terms of the socio-technical perspective on technology. Does anyone have any questions about those? I know it's a lot of information. Yeah.
Is there by any chance like an example you give of each that would help with that?
Yeah, so the social construction of technology, I would say like risk assessments, where a bunch of people say, okay, we have a problem. We have too many people in jail. We want to release more people because we don't think they all need to be in jail. How can we solve that problem? And sometimes the community might say, well, actually, we think the problem is a little bit different than that. We think that, there's over-policing going on and they shouldn't even be arrested in the first place. Or the data scientists come in and they say, the data looks fine. We don't know what you're talking about. And so they all have to come together to figure out exactly what the problem is. And this can be difficult in certain contexts if you are coming in hired to do a specific task, because you don't really have any role in the interpretive flexibility piece. You're just sort of you're providing potential solutions and helping with the stabilization. And then obviously closure kind of involves everyone. But so the relevant social groups piece can be challenging because a lot of times not all the relevant social groups are involved, just the ones in power, you could say, the ones who have the ability to make the decisions. So that would be the criminal justice agency or the system that's deciding to implement the tool. And then they will look at their options. What different risk assessments are available? What are the pros and cons? Have they been shown to solve this problem? Have they been shown to solve this problem in a community similar to ours? And then often that's the time when you'll have, like activist groups or things like that coming in and saying, oh, but this tool's biased. And so that's the stabilization is coming to more of a consensus on what the solution should be to the problem. And then closure is when everyone kind of agrees. And so they say, okay, we picked a tool, everyone's as happy as they're going to be, and we're going to implement it. And then again, like I said, if the population shifts, if there's still an overpopulation problem, then they'll come back to interpretive flexibility and say, okay, we still have a problem, and how can we fix it? So it's very cyclical. Heterogeneous engineering. The examples that I've read of this that I found to be really interesting and effective is kind of strange. It's Portuguese navigation ships in the era of like exploration, basically combining things like compasses, more advanced sailing, the laws at the time around navigation and around who can build and operate different boats, and their goal of trying to sail around Africa. And so basically they had to take into account the laws, the technology available, the weather is an element, hostile or indifferent environment, to achieve this goal. And so they're kind of bringing all of those things together at the same time, which they couldn't really avoid doing, but saying, we're aware of all of these different factors and we're aware that it might not work, but how can we take these hostile things? How can we use the weather to our advantage? Okay, well, we'll use sails and we'll take the wind and we'll use that to help us sail instead of trying to fight against the wind. So things like that where you're trying to do it all at once. There aren't that many examples of this in technology that I've found so far. A lot of times it's, we're going to build it, we're going to do it, and then if there's a problem, we'll hear about it later and then we'll go back and figure it out. So I think this is sort of it's a much more all-encompassing method of thinking about it, and it's a better way of avoiding a lot of the backlash that comes with, well, we built this and it doesn't actually work. But I haven't seen that many like modern examples of heterogeneous engineering.
Okay, it seems like it's just not, you're not worrying about the people using it, basically. I mean, or
Right.
There's just not I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I think that's just sort of in my experience, like I didn't learn about this stuff until later on. It's not really emphasized in like data science training to think about the people being impacted by the tools that you're building. Even though it's important to a lot of people, it's not as like blatant as some of the other things that we're taught. But so we'll go into a little more about how to implement some of these ideas too. So back to the definition problem. If we're trying to implement fairness or bias through either of these means, we understand that they're context dependent. So what we understand to be fairness today, societally, as we agree upon together as a group of people, might be different next year or in 10 years. And we also know that we can't really hard code them because there isn't really a way to just sort of squish them into a single definition or a single equation. And so how can we implement them is the big question. So there is a wonderful paper put out by the Data and Society Research Institute, which I highly recommend if you're interested in this type of information. They have a really great newsletter. They're based in New York, and they wrote a paper about fairness and abstraction in machine learning, which these abstraction traps are pulled from. And so there are a series of different traps that I'm going to walk us through. And what I really want is I have some discussion questions, and I want this to be more interactive. And I want us to, especially since this is kind of a smaller group, to sort of think through these traps. So I'm going to present the traps as the problems, and then we can think through how we can account for those problems or how we can avoid those traps in different situations. So I have the example of risk assessments, but if anyone else has, I know you have like healthcare, for example, if anyone else has examples from experience or just things that they're interested in that they can apply to these traps, I would love for you to mention those, and we can kind of talk through the context and how that might work. Because essentially these are things that you can take and apply later, because I don't have, all the individual contexts that you might come up with. So the first one is the framing trap. So failing to model the entire system over which social criterion such as fairness will be enforced. So think about abstraction, right? What are you accounting for? What are you including in your model? What are you saying I can not necessarily control, but I can think about how this might impact the work that I'm doing. So what we're choosing to take into account. So thinking about the social construction theory typically doesn't take the social or fairness or things like that into account from the get-go. It's kind of an afterthought or an explanation. So if you expand your framing from the beginning to include that, would you have a different outcome potentially? And also thinking about what are the choices of what are the choices that we make when building a model say about the work that we're doing and about what we want the outcomes to be. So being very conscious about what your inputs and outputs are. So this is also very relevant to something like risk assessment. The output is a risk score. The input can be a variety of different things. We tend to like to rely on criminal history, but a lot of risk assessments will go in a lot of different directions in terms of asking about personal history, familial history, employment, education, attitudes, things like that. And so if we're saying, you know, your personality, the different things that make you who you are is an input, what does that say about the fact that we're putting that into an algorithm and expecting there to be some sort of standardized output? So what kind of assumptions are we making? And, you know, in every model, when you choose a method of analysis, you're making some assumptions about that model. So thinking about expanding the framing to include more things, sort of like heterogeneous engineering. How can we think about these different elements as part of the framing as opposed to external to the framing? Yeah.
Have you ever think about, I mean, we talk about including more in the model. Do you ever think about taking certain things that may have implicit bias out of the model?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the risk assessment example, typically things like race and gender, age, well, sometimes age, because there are criminogenic factors associated with age, are usually not included. But the issue is that a lot of other variables could be proxies for those. So in the risk assessments that I've been working with recently and that we tend to promote, they tend to only look at a very small number of factors, and typically only like static factors like criminal history. So things that don't change. Criminal history can change, you know, as time goes on, you can commit more crimes, but the past isn't going to change. And so those are sort of attempts to remove, you know, we don't care if you have a job or not. We don't care what zip code you grew up in. We don't care if your parents are divorced, because a lot of those things can add in additional proxies that we don't want to see. We also try not to do interview-based tools because there's a lot of subjectivity involved in interviewing, and so you know, we'll see that especially things like aren't being scored consistently, or there's a larger minority population that has a lot of cultural differences that can often work its way in just through an interview. So it's definitely both ways. Yeah, putting more things in and taking some things out, but all depending on the context. Yeah, that's a great question. Any other thoughts on the framing trap? This one's pretty simple. Cool. So the second trap is the portability trap. And portability is typically seen as a good thing in technology. If you can build something that's applicable across lots of different domains or in lots of different contexts, that can be seen as a good thing. In certain areas, like criminal justice, oftentimes things like healthcare or like hiring, for example, you want the tool to be very specific for the population that you're using it on. And so it shouldn't necessarily be portable. So yeah, failing to understand how repurposing algorithmic solutions designed for one context might not work as well in another context. And so the two key assumptions with that is that the data observed is close enough to the facts that matter. This is also very true with criminal justice data because it can either be subjective because it's from an interview, or it can be due to other factors outside of the person's control, like things like over-policing, that tend to be systemic. So just because it's in the data doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And then groups on the whole are similar to each other with respect to the task. So we're all equal. And so the question I have is, can a system be designed with both portability and fairness as priorities?
I think that's tricky because, like you said, machine learning, we train our models. That model is going to pull out interesting signals from that population. So unless you're moving that model to another population, perhaps doing then some retraining to more refine, because there's that concept of like transfer learning where you maybe train on a certain population and then you can refine it on another population. So from just focusing on that portability perspective, I think that could be possible. I don't think you can ever just take model A, population A, and it'll work on population B unless population A and population B share similar characteristics. Fairness, on the other hand, that there's another interesting component, because then you're thinking, okay, if population A and population B are different, there could be different aspects. Fairness that you're having to take into consideration. One, say, you mentioned the hiring example, and we'll just bring up Amazon's algorithmic approach to hiring people that was highly biased towards men over women, just based on, interesting signals. I mean, that's what machine learning does. We use math to pull interesting signals out of data to then do inference. So you take something in that scenario and try and move it to another population. There might be another population where there's other biases and traps, fairness traps in there. So I think it's potentially possible, but it's very difficult to build this kind of almost standard physics model of models that can encompass all populations. Because whenever you start to the more generalized you make your models, you're losing a lot of predictive power and it's losing its utility.
Yeah, so exactly. And fairness isn't tied to a specific object. It's just tied to a context. So when you change that context, you're changing what the outcomes might look like. Yeah. And that's and to your point about the Amazon thing, using old data to make a new model is also making assumptions that the way you were doing it was the right way to do it.
Right.
And so if you're not thinking about the fact that that may not have been the right way to do it, and it's very relevant with criminal justice data too, just because we were arresting these people before, it doesn't mean we should keep arresting them, and how to disrupt that process by, I think, adding fairness as a priority can help sort of disrupt that and bring more of a critical eye to the past data to say, what's going on and should it be going on? But then the question also is, if it's not what should be going on, then what do we want to be seeing? And that can get very political in certain contexts. So that's great. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard you.
No, I'm sorry.
Cool. Any other questions, thoughts on portability? Cool. So the formalism trap. This is, we talked a lot about this sort of concept that you can't really flatten or formalize things like fairness and bias into something that's widely applicable, or even to something that's applicable in a particular context. And so they're procedural, contextual, contestable. So procedural, another example in the criminal justice system, the justice system doesn't only care about the outcome. It cares about how you got to that outcome. So whether it's someone who committed a crime. So attempted murder is still a crime just because the person didn't die. But we tend to think of things in terms of outcomes. So what happened at the end doesn't necessarily matter how we got there. So we don't want to kind of eschew all of the procedure that got us there, because that can inform the outcome. Contextual, like we've said, and contestable, not everyone agrees. And so we kind of do ourselves a disservice to try to oversimplify these concepts. And so we shouldn't sort of shy away from that necessarily, because thinking about these things as potentially conflicting or not having a definition can allow us to sort of bring more depth to our considerations of what is happening, what should be happening, and how we can make sure that we're implementing something that is not overstating how certain we are about it being fair or unbiased. So I think this one's relatively simple. But do you think that they should be formalized? Does anyone think that they should be sort of written and hard coded? No.
Well, the thing about that is, I mean, part of what gets me is, and this is more, the assumption is that we can reach a baseline of fair,
right,
which doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And same with bias.
Mm-hmm.
Just people, I mean, I don't know. I don't have an idea. So, I mean, if anyone tries that, I mean, is it like a standard deviation? Just admitting, we've got a 1% unfairness quota or something. I mean, has anyone tried doing that? I mean, short of that, I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, it's like, it's going to be unfair to some degree. I mean, we're trying, do the best you can.
Yeah. Well, I think that like the transparency is what's important, is not saying like, well, we define fairness once and for all, and this is like, it's 0.3% unfair, and that's plenty fair for us. So in something like a risk assessment validation, where you have to basically say this is working or it's not, this is biased or it's not, we will try and present the findings and say, it seems like something weird is going on here. The data can't tell you why. The data can't tell you how to fix it. It can just tell you what's going on. And we can basically say, using all of these different methods of analysis, it's either not predictive, it's not very significant, looking at the relationships, but we can't make explicit statements about why things are happening or how to fix them. And so that's the challenge, is people want that answer. They want you to say, like, check, it's unbiased, it's fair, it's perfect, go ahead. Or it's not biased, it's broken, do something different. And we can say, maybe you should try doing something different. Maybe these are the places you should look into. If the tool isn't working for one subgroup, you can say, look at your policies, look at your practices. Is there anything that could be going on there that might be causing this to happen? And then they might uncover an actual bias. But I think it's important to be clear that this is not agreed upon. And a great example of this was I don't know if any of you read the ProPublica piece, Machine Bias, about the Compass algorithm that was used in Florida. They basically found that it was biased against Black people. It was underestimating risk for white people and overestimating risk for Black people. And they used a particular statistical definition of fairness. And there was sort of an uproar in some of the academic community, because they said, well, that's not the definition we use. So you can't say that it's unfair, because based on our definition, it is fair. And my response to that was, well, that's just a difference of perspective. You can't tell someone, and this is especially true, I think, when we're talking with like activist groups and communities, their definition of fairness matters. It's not just about, what we think, what the academics think. Everyone's definition, if you're in a relevant social group, your definition should matter, and it should be addressed. It shouldn't just be ignored because, oh, well, you're just a random person on the street. And so each group may try and formalize, or each person might try and formalize these definitions in their head, and they can't necessarily be reconciled. But in order to have sort of a peaceful existence and to not have too much pushback if you're rolling out a tool or a model, I need to change my setting on here, then you need to address those concerns. And that's where all of this calling for, ethics, data science, ethics, and AI and machine learning is coming from, because a lot of these, corporations and things aren't thinking about that and are leaving it as an afterthought, or are saying these people's definitions of fairness are lesser than these definitions of fairness. And so, we should be thinking about trying to get ahead of that, whether it's to avoid backlash or just for our own moral reasons. So yeah, I think the transparency piece is really key to that.
Defining fairness in data sort of.
It's impossible.
Yeah, that's the thing. They don't want to say that. So it's like no company's ever going to say, even though we all know it, it's like, yeah, our thing is less than fair. And if you have a rational conversation with them, I think everybody will be like, I get it. Yeah. You can't be perfect, but are you trying hard? Okay. I mean, anyway.
And I can echo the transparency in the interpretability is so important, because it's one thing to be transparent, but it's also to ensure that there's a proper interpretation of what that transparency means.
Absolutely.
I think oftentimes, we can have a binary classifier and it classifies something as one thing, but it was a very weak classification. Like it just barely inched over, but some people interpret it as, oh, that is definitely that thing. Yeah. No, it barely met the criteria to be, object A, so understanding that there's this concept of everything we're doing in machine learning and AI is we're working in this realm of probability, and there's error. And we could have, transparency with perspective of what factors led to this inference that, the highest contributing factors, using techniques such as Shapley or Lime, to help. And then ensuring that when you get all this data together and you're putting it in front of someone, you give them the correct interpretation of this is how you interpret it. This is what this means. And then that way you're not having to worry about as much, having these hard fairness or bias definitions. You just look at the data, you see what the results are, and then you can adjust based on what you see.
Yeah.
But transparency is a big issue, I'm sure, with a lot of the work you do.
Yeah.
Because there's privacy concerns, there's, we don't want people to game the system, and all of these things that give people pause, but we need to work through that and figure out ways, because
it's interesting. And the transparency piece is very difficult when in the criminal justice system, and the communication, because it's like playing telephone. So I do the validation, I communicate to whoever is the receiver of that deliverable. This is what the validation says. This is the amount of certainty we have. This is what all this means. They communicate it to their team, and then somehow it trickles down the line, and then it ends up in the news. And then, but the message gets so diluted that by the end it could be, we're 100% certain that this tool isn't biased. And you're like, well, that is never what we said, or the opposite. And It's like, well, hold on. No, there are some parts that are okay. So it's, the transparency piece is super important because it sort of starts the game of telephone. So you want to be as clear as you can, but at the same time, a lot of it's out of your control. And depending on your role in all of it, there's a limited amount of correcting that you can do publicly. So it's really tricky. And I think part of that too is just like tech literacy. As we teach people what these words mean and what it is involved in these processes, I think it'll get less extreme, because there is a lot of I kind of call it like fear mongering in the media about like AI and machine learning. And they're like, AI is deciding the criminal justice system. And I'm like, that is not what is happening at all. Slow down. But it's catchy. It sells papers. And so that is a lot of what the messaging is. And so we need to I'm very big on trying to promote that like educational piece. Don't shy away from using the accurate technical terms, but explain what those things mean, which is like not necessarily totally related to this, but that's one of my soapboxes at work, is like, we shouldn't not use these big words or these, statistical terms because they're accurate. We should explain what they mean and educate people so that when they see these headlines, they're not panicking and they have a better understanding of what's actually going on.
I think as a recovering journalist, I mean, you're talking, you write at an 8th grade level.
Yeah.
Is what it's. I mean, that's what you kind of have to do. I mean, it's kind of, but it'd be good. Trying to teach. That's a tall order, but it's that's a tough one.
At the very least, on the policy end of things, we can. We can explain it. It's possible. No, it's not. Yeah. Absolutely.
So when you talk about transparency, or I was at a recent meeting in criminal justice right now. This topic is really near and dear because I'm working on a predictive model for burglaries. And
I think I was there when you talked about that. Actually, yeah.
And we're meeting again on Friday, and I've got now 10 years of data as opposed to 3 years of data. So it'll be fun to play with that. And we're spending all of our time trying not to include bias in that model, but at a recent thing, pretrial release is like a big deal now.
Yes.
So pretrial release means, when you're arrested, you can obviously go out on bail, and that has to be a secured bond, from usually a bailsman, yourself, or your property. And now pretrial release is looking at making it unsecure, where you're just released, and if you don't come back, technically there's no way they can really get you back. But it's because of overcrowding in the jail system. They don't want to build another jail, so they're trying to alleviate that. So one of the problems is we could build a perfect model, we could do everything perfect, but they don't have enough cells to put the people that the model says should go into jail. So when they say, we'll release people that are first-time offenders, well, they do that and they still don't have anywhere to put the people that are repeat offenders. Well, what are they going to do? And so they're releasing people that have, been arrested 11 times, but and right now, Davidson County is having a lot of issues with this.
So that's what I work on, is pretrial risk assessments.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And there's a certain county that's voting on it on Thursday.
Yeah.
Since we're being recorded, I won't say that. I'd love to tell you about it.
No, absolutely. But so the pretrial piece is very interesting. A lot of places actually do have release on recognizance that has existed for a long time. There are some constitutional issues around the bail thing, and sort of the lack of indigency or ability to pay determinations, because people constitutionally are not supposed to be held in jail due to inability to pay. There are also a lot of issues around the way that judges and set bail. So I've done this work in a few states, and typically states implement risk assessments because they know that they have a population that shouldn't be in jail in the first place. And so there have been a lot of studies, I can send you some if you're interested, that show that most people that are incarcerated, like, I think this may be prison and jail number, but around like 40% of people are not actually a risk to public safety and could be released. And so usually what pretrial risk assessments look at is failure to appear, history of failure to appear, to predict future failure to appear, and new criminal arrests during the pretrial period. And so trying to see if people have done these things before, if they're a risk to do them again. Because, technically, if you're not convicted of a crime, unless you are a serious risk to public safety, you should be able to be released, is the constitutional standard. And so typically what we see is that they know, a lot of these places know that they can be releasing more people, they just don't know which people.
Yeah.
And so the risk assessment helps them identify which people should be released. And there's also like unsecured bonds too, where if you don't show up, then you have to pay, where you don't have to pay anything out of pocket just to be released. But that's the area that I work in. And it's very interesting. It's very challenging. It's very political. And the data is not great, especially on a national level. So it's really hard to get, like, there's not a ton of research. And so a lot of what we're doing is helping to sort of build up that research. But yeah, it's difficult because everyone has an opinion. Everyone thinks they know what's right when it comes to, releasing people. So it's very challenging. And to say, it's not biased when our criminal justice system has a history of being very biased. So how do you disentangle those things, which is sort of what got me into researching this stuff. Yeah.
Obviously, if somebody has a past history of being arrested, you can look at that. But what if they don't?
Right.
And do you release everybody that doesn't have a past history? And if it's that's a pretty tough one too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have to then base it on who they are, their characteristics, their demographics, and now you're adding incredible bias into.
Well, and risk assessments can't replace judges. They can only be additional information for the judges to use. So no matter what, there's going to be a human making that decision, which is.
But there's a difference between a judge and a magistrate, right?
Yeah.
So the person that releases that individual is not a judge.
It can be. It depends on the jurisdiction.
In certain counties around here, that's not the case.
Yeah.
So it's an individual. It's somebody like you.
Right.
Could be anybody. You don't need to be an elected official.
And that's where I think the transparency and interpretation becomes important. When anyone's making any decision, making sure you're not presenting them some sort of binary inference, but you're presenting them. It's not black and white. Nothing in machine learning is black and white. We live in the gray. So making sure that gray is understood and what led to that kind of inference to give them, because that's to me the beauty of machine learning, is there's a lot of information that comes in that's beneath the surface of whether you're calling it object A or object B.
Absolutely. All right. Next one, the ripple effect trap. This is pretty simple. Failure to understand how the insertion of technology into an existing social system changes the behaviors and embedded values of the system. So basically, putting on a new piece of technology changes the original context that technology was created for. So reinforcement politics involve existing groups using new technology to reinforce or argue for power and position. For example, management at your company installs employee tracking software on your computers. Again, risk assessments can be used to reinforce past decisions that reinforce, various systems of oppression. And then reactivity behaviors also alter the context. So basically any sort of reaction as it relates to the technology. So for example, like you said, gaming the system. If you put out this tool and you make it available how the score is calculated, if there is any room for subjectivity in there, people can try and take advantage. It really doesn't happen that often, but it's an example of reactivity behaviors. that could even be true of like hiring. It's like, okay, well, I'm gonna put a bunch of text in white at the bottom that has all the keywords I think they're looking for, so that the like machine reading resume software will like float me to the top. So I think that was pretty straightforward. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah, cool. And we also know that we can't predict what's going to happen. We can't predict it, and so we have to know that and be clear about that, be transparent about that going in, and also try and think about what are the what if scenarios, just so that you can, try and account for them as much as you can. And a lot of times they do like follow patterns. So you can say, okay, someone tried to implement something similar a year ago. How did that go? What did they forget to account for? And how can we not fall into the same trap?
One thing that comes to mind is, I don't know if people are aware of like these kind of things, is the Microsoft Taybot. I don't know if.
Oh, yes. Oh, that was a weird one.
That was a very weird one. For people that have not heard of this instance, this is where Microsoft had trained an AI, like a neural network, to mimic on Twitter, to mimic the speech of that of a teenage girl. And what happened, so they released this bot, and it was supposed to be kind of a learning. So as people tweeted at it and interacted with it, it would learn and kind of supposedly refine its speech. Unfortunately, there was a large group of people that decided to say very awful things to it. And over time, they trained this Twitter bot to be just a very hateful speech spewing Twitter bot. And it just was, Microsoft had to shut it down within 24 hours.
Yeah, it was like the trolls descended and then they were like, nope, we're cutting it, we're done.
so I was pausing because I was trying to think of like the ripple effect. So essentially this is where you inserted this technology and you really weren't quite sure what was going to happen. And the system descended on it and... Yeah,
they didn't account for trolls.
Yeah, they did not.
They didn't think that anyone, which is kind of like shocking to me, that they didn't think that training a bot on Twitter users wouldn't result in something a little funky, or at least didn't like say, don't use these words ever, or things like that. Yeah, that was not the best foresight on their part. It was entertaining for the 24 hours that it was happening.
Entertaining. And you're just like, oh, it's a train wreck. I can't.
Yeah, it was a rapid descent. It was bad. Yeah, that was an interesting day on the internet. Yeah, that's a great example. Awesome. So solutionism trap, Maslow's hammer. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is an easy one. I think this one's talked about a little more. Technology might not be the right solution, or your particular idea might not be the right solution. And to sort of examine your perspective and to think about your perspective as being sort of equal to all the perspectives of the other relevant social groups and not privileged just because you're the one building the tool. So how do we know whether the best solution is technology? Talk to people, ask questions. Don't just assume that you know everything. And so if the definitions of fairness are politically contested or shifting, if the modeling required would be way too complex, are there ways around that? And if not, maybe this isn't the right solution. And being comfortable with saying, I don't think that implementing machine learning here would be the best solution. I don't think that it would necessarily result in the best outcomes. So being able to say that, and I know a lot of times, depending on how your work is set up or whatever, you might not be in a position to say this isn't the best solution, or to say we're not going to do this. But I think it's another aspect of transparency and being honest and saying, I've looked at it and I don't know that this is really going to be what works for you. And so that's a harder one to do, like personally and in when you're hired to do something, to say, actually, I don't think I should do this job. But it's also important because, there are impacts that can occur when you implement technology when it doesn't necessarily need to be or shouldn't be. Any questions, comments on this one? No, pretty simple. Right. So those are all the traps. So what should we do? Any ideas? So basically, instead of trying to think of there's a solution to everything, thinking of things as, here are the different steps that we can take. Here is the sort of structure. Here are the different questions we should be asking ourselves to get to whatever the right answer is for that particular situation. So frameworks don't have answers. They can't tell us what to do, but they can help us consider all the different factors instead of trying to just think in our own heads, sort of look and say, okay, here are the different steps that have been laid out. Am I checking these boxes? Are there any red flags? And thinking about the process as well as the output, and making sure that you're not too focused on the end result. Those are my suggestions and some of the suggestions in the paper. Any other thoughts?
I think you talked about, whenever there's a relevant social group, doing your best to interview them and try and figuring out ways to, if you come up with a solution, that you could kind of talk through your solution with them to see like, okay, this is kind of what we're thinking. What are your thoughts on that? And if, of course, it's a tricky balance to try and strike that right line of communication and transparency.
Mm-hmm.
But I think just having a conversation, talking to the relevant social groups, I think that's, like in all business problems, talk to the stakeholders, talk to the people that will be impacted or have a stake in something.
Yeah, absolutely. And we find this is even true, like just understanding the data that we're given is going back and being like, okay, we made all these assumptions, but let's talk through the process, because you always miss something. It's impossible to know everything, especially when you're getting data from like an external source, or if there are questions about the quality, or if you don't really understand how that data came to be how it is. It's really important to ask those questions and to not think that it's like a sign of weakness or something that you don't know everything. It's really important to keep that conversation going through the development process. And like you said, like talking through it and saying, okay, here's what we did, here's what we're going to do. Is there anything here that just is like, nope, actually that doesn't make any sense based on what we understand? Super important. Okay, so these are the list of questions that they kind of round out the paper with, and I think they're pretty helpful in terms of having like a checklist to think through. So is the technological solution appropriate in the first place? That should definitely be the first question. Does the solution affect the social context in a predictable way, such that the problem remains solved once you've introduced the technology? If you introduce the technology, will it change what the problem is, and will you have to come up with a whole new solution? Can it appropriately handle robust understandings of social requirements? That's a hard one. And also it really depends on the context. Has the solution appropriately modeled the social and technical requirements of the actual context in which it will be deployed? So if you are trying to take a model from a different context and apply it to your own, you need to make sure that you're going through those steps to make sure it still works in the population. We see this with risk assessments all the time. People are like, oh, Virginia's got a cool risk assessment, let's implement it in Ohio or, wherever. And they say, well, it's been validated there, so that means it works. And it's like, well, no, you have to validate it on your population because it might not work. That's a different place. You laugh, but it's very, very common. Lots of states develop their own, and then people say, that looks great, we'll implement it over here. So like the VPRE, Virginia's risk assessment, is used in a lot of different places. And a lot of times people don't validate. I've seen assessments that haven't been validated in like 10, 20 years. And so that's super important to be like, is this working for the context? And then is the solution heterogeneously framed to include the data and the social actors relevant? So are you forgetting any important pieces? Are you talking to the right people? Are you looking at the right data? Do you understand the historical context that might be relevant? And have you, and try to incorporate that from the beginning if you can, because it'll make all the other steps fall into place better. So you're not going back and saying, oh no, we have to go back and change this because we didn't think about that. And obviously it's unavoidable that things will come up, but the more you can think about these things on the front end, I think the easier it is moving forward to continue those lines of communications once you've established them. Any questions about these? Cool. So final thoughts. This is like pretty much the same stuff we've been saying, but ask yourself whether the solution will consistently lead towards the desired goals, and if there are any what ifs that you can think of, would any of those result in things not moving in the direction that you're hoping for. So you want to try and as much as possible avoid anything that will lead away from the desired goal. So in the example of risk assessments, if it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, it's just reinforcing all of the problems that were there in the first place. And so if you aren't trying to take into account, how can we make sure that even if something goes wrong, it's not having the opposite desired effect? How can we do that? Which is very difficult. But a lot of times when you're, like I said, with work, you can't necessarily say, no, we're not going to do this. If that's what the client wants, that's what the client wants. But to make them aware that, like, if you don't keep validating this thing, you might end up exacerbating the problem. And like we said, take the concerns of relevant social groups seriously, and don't make assumptions about their welfare. If you're trying to do something that's good for someone, you need to talk to them and make sure that's actually what's good for them. And just being inclusive outside perspectives, not privileging your own perspective or the perspective of whoever hired you to do the thing, because you'll miss things that way, and it's much easier to fall into these traps if you aren't listening and asking questions. And then clearly state the limitations. Just be very open and honest if you can. I'm a big fan of radical transparency. I think it makes things much easier and less confusing, and it doesn't come back to bite you if you overstate something. You never know if someone's going to come back and say, look, you said that we were this certain, and what's going on? It's not working. It's much better, I think, to really be open and honest about exactly what you're doing and why and how you expect it to work. So that is pretty much it in terms of the socio-technical perspective. I'm happy to send out the paper. There are a couple papers that I used for this that were super interesting, that go into even more in detail and give tons of examples about how all of these different traps come into play, and outline some more potential solutions. Again, I'll plug Data and Society because they're amazing. They do really interesting work. They do actually a lot of interesting work involving social media. So if anyone's interested in that, definitely check them out. They also do lots of like web streamed, they call them data bites. So you can see them remotely from Nashville. And they just are really conscious about these issues. And I went to a lot of their events. They really helped me with my thesis on risk assessment algorithms. So they're really cool people. I highly recommend checking them out. Data and Society Institute.
Could you send me an email with all this stuff?
Yes.
And then I will make sure it gets to you.
The PowerPoint and my contact info, I have cards too. And then the paper, and then, everything. I'll send you everything. Yeah, cool. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry I came in late. I wondered if you could talk about your clients, and I'm interested in the kinds of people, organizations and stuff that look at this. And whether or not there's anything about the framework that can be sort of abstracted and applied in other areas.
Yeah, I think everything about the framework, I think, definitely can be applied, really broadly applicable. The clients that I work with at the Crime and Justice Institute tend to be criminal justice agencies. So administrative offices of the courts, pretrial services departments. Those are typically who will bring us in. And then my side, I do more policy implementation and technical assistance. I do a little bit of like front end data collection and policy development, but primarily I do the sort of back end. And so what you're running, who I work with and what they're...
So it's typically governmental agencies.
Yeah, so we do, Criminal Justice Institute strictly does criminal justice reform policy, public policy.
So what other arenas are you? I guess finance would probably use something like that.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of really interesting examples from like the financial crisis of people who were involved in finance and were doing, working on these algorithms and things and didn't really realize how huge of an impact their work had on everyone. There's some good pop science books like Weapons of Math Destruction and
very good book.
Hello World has some good examples too. So absolutely that their healthcare implications, like hiring algorithms, even things like credit score. Anything that an algorithm can be used for is going to have an impact on people. And so I think it's really widely applicable. And in the paper, they go through tons of it, including like the Portuguese sailing example. They go through a lot of different ways that that you can look at this framework, because it's really just about the perspective. And so if you are it's easy to get pretty narrowly focused when you're doing this kind of work on, okay, this is what I've been asked to do, this is a problem I'm solving, these are the outcomes we want, and to not necessarily think about the scope of what's going on, the data, where it came from, how it came to be, the problem, where it came from, how it came to be, and the potential options for solutions. So really just thinking intentionally through that process. I think the intentionality and transparency are kind of the two big themes in all of this, and just saying, this is my skill set, this is my perspective, there are others, and they need to be incorporated to make sure this actually works, and then communicating the results very clearly. And I think that's applicable in pretty much any like data science, machine learning, AI sort of situation. But a lot of it also is contextuality. So it really depends on the situation, how you do that, and what it looks like. But those are sort of the broader principles.
Yeah, I was thinking of social agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Domestic abuse.
Yeah. Well, and things like that are very difficult to predict and to model for, because there are so many historical and social things that go into that data. And disentangling them is very difficult, and they're also very political. So if you want to make a statement about what's fair or what fairness looks like in those situations, everyone has sort of different understandings of how history is played out, how whether people should be released from jail or not, that are just based on our own experiences and our own understandings. And so they're not easy decisions to make, and there's always going to be a tension and a push and pull. But it's even more important in situations where you're dealing with people's lives and liberties to really be intentional about this, and to really consult the relevant social groups as you're going through the process, because they're the ones who are going to be directly impacted by it. And I think, especially in criminal justice, that's really a difficult thing for agencies to want to do, because it's political, and they don't want to get involved. They'll talk with advocacy groups at a very high level, and they'll do that. But a lot of times they end up leaving, these meetings not feeling like they were heard, or not feeling like their concerns were taken seriously. And that's not ideal. But getting them to, everyone to kind of come together is extremely difficult. So, yeah, it has to be practical. You can't always implement all of it all the time. But if it's something that you kind of keep in the back of your head and you try and implement as much as you can move towards having a more socially aware process as much as you can. But yeah, it's definitely not easy. Cool. Well, it's like 9:15.
Yeah, we're a bit over. We started a little late, so I
Yeah.
thought we'd go a little bit over, but just to myself in the street, I would like to first thank you, Vanna, for coming out and leading this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for everyone coming out, and thank you for everyone on the live stream. I will be, like always, I'll try and get the video edited and posted within the next few days, and I'll work with Vanna to get all of the amazing sources she has condensed in an email that I'll send out to everyone. I'll post it to Slack, and I'll also post it to the Meetup. So wherever you would like to get it. Thank you again to Tech Systems for bringing out coffee. And they have some interesting job opportunities for anyone who's looking to make a career change. So highly recommend reaching out to them. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.